Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is another one of our series of lectures that deals with the civil rights era, the 1950s and the 1960s. Today we're going to be looking at the Supreme Court and a very important Supreme Court decision that happens that makes a huge impact in the civil rights movement in the 1950s. And we'll be looking at that fight for children to kind of end that practice of school segregation in the United States. The reading for today comes from pages 870 to 874. The civil rights movement takes shape. Our guiding questions for this particular lesson are: how were schools segregated for white and black students? What were some problems of this segregation? Why did Linda Brown want to attend an all-white school in Topeka, Kansas? What did the Supreme Court rule in Brown versus Board of Education? Who was Thurgood Marshall? Who were the Little Rock Nine? And then how did President Eisenhower protect the rights of the Little Rock Nine? So that's going to be kind of our guiding questions and focus this year. I have here an image of an African-American school set in the 1950s. And I want you to take a moment, if you need to pause the video, to kind of look at this image and see what you notice. You probably noticed that this is a kind of a very old-looking school, right? There's not a lot of specialized equipment. The walls are wood, the floors are wood, the desks are kind of old-looking, kind of, you can tell they've been worn. The chalkboard's been definitely very worn. You've got not a lot of lighting in this house. You got like one light bulb that's sticking down here, kind of there in the middle section right here. You got like one stove that is providing, the heat for the entire classroom. It doesn't definitely look like a state-of-an-art type of school for these students to be attending. And this was a huge problem because of Jim Crow and segregation, that there were separate schools, but they definitely were not equal if you compare them to the schools of comparable schools of the time period. So African American schools, K through 12, typically were older buildings, kind of dirtier, run down. The classrooms were oftentimes overcrowded. They may not have had enough chairs for all the students to sit in, or enough desks for the students to sit in. Students had actually very few resources, textbooks, maps, or just generally library resources. Some states even had actual laws in place that said that white schools were forbidden from providing older resources to go down to some of those African American schools. And even at the college level, after high school, there were very few colleges that would even admit African American students into their colleges. And even if they would allow them into the college, many African Americans had to overcome a great deal of racism and segregation. And there's this great story of G.W. McLaurin, who was able to get to an all-white college, but his professors refused to allow him to come and sit in his classes. So this student would have to sit in the hallway and kind of listen in through the door and take notes as the professor was providing the notes in the lecture for their students. And this student had to take the notes and pass the exams without having to actually be in class, and didn't have these kinds of videos that they could watch. So definitely placed at a deep disadvantage. So we see here two images here, kind of the same time period, an all African American elementary school and an all white elementary school. Totally separate. African Americans were in their own schools, white students were in their own separate schools. They were separate, but could you argue that they were equal? It's hard to make that argument. There's just too big a difference between the quality in both of these schools. And then enters in a very brave young girl named Linda Brown. And Linda Brown lived in a place called Topeka, Kansas, and she actually attended an all African American school that was 21 blocks away from her house. And there was actually an all-white elementary school that was just 5 blocks away, a lot closer, and she wouldn't have to necessarily walk that distance to that school. And according to segregation laws in Kansas at the time, she was not allowed to attend the all-white school. And so her parents sue the school board, and eventually that case winds its way up to the United States Supreme Court. Remember, we talked about our 3 branches of government. You have the executive branch, the president, who enforces the law. You have the legislative branch, the Congress, that passes the laws. And then, of course, you have the judicial branches that act as our judges, our referees, decide, are these laws, in fact, constitutional or not. And so this case makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and the case is argued in front of the 9 Supreme Court justices, and the Supreme Court comes back and rules in May 17th, 1954, in what becomes a hallmark decision, a monumental decision in terms of civil rights, in what's called Brown v. Board. Sometimes it's known as Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. And in that ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation of schools was not equal and therefore not fair. And segregated schools were no longer constitutionally protected under Plessy versus Ferguson, the law we had talked about before, the Supreme Court ruling we had talked about before, that no more separate white and black schools. This is a photograph here. You see George E.C. Hayes, Thurgood Marshall, and James Nabbit. These were lawyers who worked for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and they had argued Linda Brown's case very successfully in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and were able to get a major victory in this particular case. So how do you think it was for Linda's first day of elementary school? You might think it would be very difficult. She will be the only African American student that will be attending the school. I imagine that there are some students that might tease or bully her. There might be other students that might be kind of curious and might try to befriend her and be nice to her. The Supreme Court ruling and the Brown versus Board of Education ruling begins to start to chip away at this practice of segregation, and also begins to try to push for the end of racial segregation in the public schools. An important person that argued that case, we talked about Thurgood Marshall a little bit ago. He also has a very important part to play and an impact with the Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall, a very talented lawyer, will actually in 1967 will be appointed to be the first African American to sit on the United States Supreme Court, and he will serve for 24 years as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And so his future is very bright after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling here. Just because Linda Brown was given permission to go to an all-white school, it doesn't mean that it's going to immediately end school-wide segregation across the country. And in fact, it's going to take a lot of additional individuals and cases to slowly chip away at this pretty long-standing practice that had been around since, Reconstruction and after the Civil War, to provide for equal access to public education. So another important group that plays a very important role in the chipping away of segregation of schools is a group known as the Little Rock Nine. In 1957, using the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board, a district judge, which is a lower court, said that the public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, had to go through the process of what they call desegregation, to allowing African Americans to attend all white schools. That's known as also as integration. And so 9 African American students are going to try and enter an all-white high school known as Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. A lot of parents in Little Rock and a lot of the community members were outraged by this action by this federal court. And so there was a lot of anger and a lot of animosity of this changing of the status quo, of letting African Americans go to this all-white high school. And so for these particular students, they in fact try to go their first day, and the governor, a guy named Governor Faubus, calls out the Arkansas National Guard and actually sets them up around the high school and blocks their entrance with guns and bayonets and prevents them from actually being able to enter into that high school. Now, this is a federal judge who is ordering the school district and the state to begin the process of desegregation. And here you have a governor who is willingly opposing federal statute and federal law. And it creates quite a bit of controversy. And the president at the time, President Eisenhower, had to make a decision. Does he allow the state of Arkansas to disregard this federal ruling, or does he, as the president, have to step in and enforce that ruling to make sure it's carried out? And Eisenhower decides to actually step in. He calls out the 101st Airborne, the U.S. Army, and actually sends them down in jeeps and with rifles and bayonets to actually escort those Little Rock Nine into the high school so that they could attend school there. So it's crazy. I mean, you've got people protesting outside of the school. You've got the Ku Klux Klan that's there. You've got the National Guard. You've got the U.S. Airborne, 101st Airborne. I mean, it is absolute crazy and just extreme amount of tension. The amazing thing about Eisenhower's actions were this is the first time in 81 years, not since President Ulysses S. Grant during Reconstruction, has a sitting U.S. president use their executive power to enforce laws in these southern states involving the protection of rights for African Americans. And so this is a really big deal, that a president is enforcing the law in the South to protect the rights of African Americans. What do you think it was like for many African Americans, including the Little Rock Nine, to come into those schools, all white schools? This is a classic image from the Little Rock Nine episode. And you can see here in this photograph that you have a lot of angry people screaming, giving the stink eye. And the bravery of these kids is truly phenomenal. Because the guard, the airborne, only protected them to the doors. Once they got into the school, it was bullying center. They were spit on, they were tripped. One girl gets her hair caught on fire, and here's the thing, they couldn't respond. They couldn't react back violently, because if they did, they would be suspended from school, and it would show that you couldn't safely integrate the races in public schools. And so this was a big deal. So they had to kind of turn the other cheek as this was all going on to try and demonstrate that there could be an integration of schools between whites and blacks. And so this is a pretty big deal. And it's going to continue on with other court cases and other judges ruling in the 1960s and the 1970s and even into the early 1980s in an effort to try to bring about the integration of public schools so that you're not having a segregation of white schools and black schools and a unfair disadvantage in those African American schools. So this has been our video lecture looking at the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, ruling that separate but equal is not constitutional. It's not protected by the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and that schools needed to begin the process of desegregation. And we have examples like the Little Rock Nine, where those 9 African American high school kids had to go to their school and say, we want equal access to that same public education that the white students are getting at that school. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please come talk to me. But otherwise, thanks for listening.